Hello and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about my experience playing Final Fantasy I, the first game in my Year of Final Fantasy challenge, and a game that I completed and I feel like I'm ready to talk about. So to remind everybody, the plan here was to take all the Final Fantasy main series games, which are 13 of them, and in the year of 2020, play as many of them as I can, complete as many of them as I can, and really go as far as I can get. And I've talked about this in my previous videos, so feel free to go check those out. But generally speaking, the early parts of the series, I've played a lot less than the later half of the series. So my goal really was to especially focus on the first half of the series, but also to try to complete as many of them as I reasonably could. So let's talk about Final Fantasy 1. So obviously, first Final Fantasy game. As a reminder, I'm playing the Dawn of Souls version. So I played the Dawn of Souls, which is 1 and 2, together. I played on an emulator, but I do have my original copy. It's just easier to play it on computer. And talking about how I played the game is kind of interesting because I really tried to be as classical as possible. I tried to approach it from let's be balanced, let's be, doing things normally, as it were. I didn't want to do anything funny or anything fancy, although in some ways maybe that would have been interesting. So let's talk about how long the game took me. So start to finish, playing Final Fantasy I took me about 10 and a half hours. This was, I think, pretty appropriate. I didn't really do any of the extended sort of side dungeon-y kind of things. I felt like by the end of the game I was powerful enough that I didn't really want to spend a lot of time grinding and going through extra content that wasn't really necessary. With that being said, I think I might go back and do that at some point if I ever am interested in doing so. I think I still have my save file, so it's not something I'm opposed to, but it was just something I didn't choose to do. I'm trying to spend just the time for the story, just for the main events. And playing Final Fantasy I actually had 0 full party wipe game overs. Now, I didn't necessarily expect to track this stat, but as I played through the games, this became for me sort of a good marker of how difficult the game was. So for me, I felt like Final Fantasy I was a pretty good place. I think there were some places where I was confused and I lost characters and I maybe didn't do as good of a job playing the game as I would have thought. But generally speaking, I didn't find it all that difficult. And it went fairly quickly from my perspective. So let me talk about what I did like in Final Fantasy I. So I really, really enjoyed the party choice that you have in the game. So when you start the game, if you haven't played it, you can pick from the classes that are on screen here. There's 6 of them. And you pick these, and then later they upgrade and you get more powerful abilities, but you pick and it determines a large part of how you're going to play the game. And for me, I went fighter, red mage, white mage, black mage, because I wanted to just be classic. Part of that was these are classes I've all really enjoyed in later games. Part of it was also the influence of things like 8-bit theater and those kinds of things. But that was a class I chose. I figured, why not do more magic? I think magic parties are fun. I thought the idea of having more mages seemed better than having less mages. Now, I really liked this part because it gave me a sense of feeling of like, oh, if I played the game a different second time or a different time, it would be different. And I thought that was really cool. I liked the idea of it. And I liked the ability to have flexibility and sort of having unique strategies based on what classes I picked. I also really enjoyed the power fantasy of the game. As the game goes on, as you get upgrades, as you get new spells, you really start to feel like you're really doing well. And there are places in the game where you hit like sort of a curve where your power spikes pretty nicely, and it feels really good. And that was something I really enjoyed playing Final Fantasy I. I loved seeing my characters get stronger. I liked kitting them out. I liked finding new items that made my characters ridiculously powerful, which is, a very classic RPG kind of thing. And it was really cool to me that was a big part of Final Fantasy I, at least for me. I definitely could see how you maybe spike at different times, or you would get different feelings based maybe on what classes you picked, or what part of the game you liked. But I really liked the idea of it, and I think the game did a really good job of giving you a sense of progression throughout. So you start as basically random nobodies, which, it's a RPG, so of course you do, right? But I think it works really nicely. And by the end, you get this really nice sort of like, you're the saviors of the world kind of feeling, which, is classic, but is a cool thing. And I was happy to see it here. So let's talk about a little bit about what I didn't like about Final Fantasy 1. So there are some pretty dry moments of Final Fantasy 1. There were times where you're going around doing things that really aren't fun. So for me, one of these was after I upgraded my characters. So for example, the fighter, I chose fighter, and then you get upgraded to knight, and then you get magic. But you have to actually go back and buy spells that maybe you weren't able to equip before. So I had to spend a lot of time flying back around to old towns to buy more spells, and that wasn't really that fun to me. I wish there was a different way to do that. There's also places within the story or within going through dungeons and things that really weren't all that interesting or weren't all that fun. So things like you hear this about something at a random stop, and then you have to go get this other item and then go all the way back to that random stop. It wasn't really for me. It's usually better in more modern games where you just, they're more streamlined, or you have better travel options, or whatever it is. I found that traveling piece a bit annoying. Also, some of the plot points are kind of strange and send you to weird places and don't make a lot of sense. And maybe that's a translation thing. Maybe that's, a stylistic difference after all these years. I'm not quite sure. But there were some dry moments that I wasn't super into. Especially there were parts in dungeons where I'm just going through it, slogging through it, and the layouts aren't that interesting or not fun. So, the other thing is the story is very bare bones. The story very much reminds me of a sort of just the framework of an RPG story of there's a bad guy, you go kill him. There are monsters you hear rumors about, and then you fight them, and there's these 4 fiends and crystals, and it's good for what it is, but it is pretty bare bones. Especially there are moments where just there's no bits about anything that's going on. It's just kind of leading you place to place, doing task and task. And then sort of the end parts of the story get real weird, where it's there's time travel and weirdness, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So that was one part that I maybe wished was a little bit different, or maybe had different hints throughout it. I think there was a lot of cool things that other games in the series have done really well. So for example, in Final Fantasy VIII, there's a lot of theories about time travel and time loops and reality and all this. And I think Final Fantasy 1 kind of did some of those same things, but it wasn't in the depth that maybe hooks people into thinking about it. So there was that. So let me tell you about what surprised me with Final Fantasy 1. So this is not something I really knew going into the game, but Final Fantasy 1 has so much in common with Dungeons and Dragons. And I found out when doing the research and talking about it later with people that it turns out that Final Fantasy 1 was actually really based on original Dungeons and Dragons. That it was sort of this almost direct translation into a video game, which does make a lot of sense. A lot of the spells are named things that they exactly are in D&D or very close. The classes are similar to what you would find in D&D. And interestingly, the story to me felt so much like playing D&D. Here's this framework. You go here, you do this, you acquire this item, you fight this boss. I think that felt so much like D&D to me, which is really cool. I love Dungeons and Dragons, and I love RPGs just at their core. So I think Final Fantasy did a great job of taking that and translating it into something that felt unique, but also felt very much like you were playing Dungeons and Dragons by yourself with, just you in this game. And I thought that was really cool. And in some ways, I almost wish the later Final Fantasy series had been more like Dungeons and Dragons. I think it has taken its own thing and it's gone in its own directions. But that's something that I really, almost wish there was more of. And I wish that more of that influence shone through occasionally. But now that I think about it, a lot of the monsters, a lot of the bosses, a lot of the classics are straight out of Dungeons and Dragons, right? Tiamat, the dragon, is a Dungeons and Dragons thing, right? So there's all that. So let's talk about my verdict of the game. So I went into Final Fantasy 1 not really expecting a whole lot. I figured it's the first one. There's probably not anything super special about it, although it's probably a cool experience, right? And I was surprised in a good way by this game. I enjoyed it. I got hooked into it. I would just play for long periods of time without really thinking about it, which is something I really enjoyed. I thought it was good in that way. It also, surprised me how fun and interesting it was at times. The little bits and pieces they did have, some of those bits of story moments are actually kind of cool, and surprised me how well they showed up. I also like the idea of just like you going around and like you get a pirate ship and now you're sailing, and then eventually you get the airship, and that all felt sort of natural. So I was surprised in a good way by this game. I will say, given my experience of the game and having played it all the way through, I think maybe I would have made different choices. And when I say this means a few different things, but the main one I thought about was my party composition. So I picked Red Mage because, generally speaking, I find Red Mage characters to be fairly powerful because you can do a lot of different things with them. And I liked my party. I liked the idea of it. But by the end of the game, my Red Mage was kind of obsolete, or at least like not using all of its skills in impressive and interesting ways. And so in some ways, I wish I would have picked a different party. And the cool part about the game is I could go back and play it again and play it with a totally different party. And there are people that do that. I've seen people that do runs of 4 fighters. And I think that would be cool. I don't know if I want to do it exactly that way, but I do think I would have made different choices here. Also, I maybe think I would have gone and done maybe some of the content, the extra content, got better loot and done all that stuff. That I didn't, I don't think is like a crime. I don't think I missed out on anything, but that is something worth thinking about. But honestly, too, I wish I would have played this game earlier. I thought it was fun. It was a cool little diversion. And so I recommend it. I thought it was really good. I thought it was a fun little, throwback sort of time capsule kind of a game. So yeah, that's my verdict here. And that's my experience of playing Final Fantasy 1. I really enjoyed it. I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did, honestly. But yeah, let me know if you've played it, what you thought about, if there are things maybe were similar or different from your run, if you tried a different, interesting party combination. I'd love to hear how somebody who did something a little with more novelty felt. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. So I will see you in the next one, hopefully to talk about Final Fantasy 2. See you next time.